Right, good afternoon. This is a roundup session of the hearings that we've been having here in the week. It's a bit unfortunate about the setting. It'd been a lot better sat around the table face to face, but never mind. It's as much for the council to participate as it is to me. So, you know, the fact that it's formal doesn't mean to say that we have to actually conduct the meeting formally. So by all means interrupt me whenever you want to. Challenge what I'm saying, criticise avenues of thought that I happen to have, okay? Before we get there though, I should tell members of the public, if you didn't know, there's presumably no fire alert this afternoon. No, okay, so if the alarms go off, it's out the doors at the back there and disappear from the site as soon as possible. If the alarm, if that's blocked, then we go the other way and do the same sort of thing. Please turn your mobile phones off if you've got them on. Don't think there's anything else, certainly not that I can think of. I quite clearly haven't absorbed everything that was said over the last 3 days. I'd be an absolute genius if I could take all that in and remember it all. What I've got to say at the moment are, without prejudice to anything that might come later, but they are my provisional thoughts. And I don't want, you know, to basically waste time by sort of sitting away, because I can't get back to you early next week because I've got other things on. And you might well want to be doing things. Just to remind everybody what my purpose is, it is not to improve this plan. It's basically to assess it in the context of the tests of soundness that are in the framework, and to tell the council if I don't think it is sound, give them opportunities to make it sound, and if they don't make it sound, then, you know, I write a report that says the plan's unsound. Or otherwise, I write a report that says if they did X, Y, and Z, then the plan would be sound. And that really, you know, writing that report is really the main thing that's about, and that's partly why I will be coming from certain viewpoints as this afternoon, and no doubt subsequently. It's a sign of the times, I suppose, perhaps sad, but as with planning decisions, they are increasingly challenged in the courts, and this part of the country seems to have far more of its fair share of challenges to local plans than certainly the part of the country that I live in. It's probably because of development land values, and it isn't actually that expensive to go to the courts in the context of what land is worth. And, you know, I'm increasingly in the Section 78 context beginning to think that people challenge anything knowing that if you can win 1 out of 6, you pay for the other 5. And, you know, if you look through the lists of people who challenge, you know, there's a number of names keep cropping up. I hope this doesn't get to a challenge, but if we're going to stop it getting for a challenge, then what I say needs to be watertight. And I'm pretty sure that either way, there are going to be quite a lot of disgruntled people at the end of the day, on both sides of the argument, no doubt. And as I say, it's my job to make sure that we can't, you know, you don't end up in the courts at the end as a result of it. So, can I ask you what you thought about the last 3 days of hearings?
What did I think? I thought there were good debates, sir. I think it was a good discussion around the objective assessment and need and the complexity of planning in Hatfield and the complexities of housing market areas, which I think is very complex in this part of the world. I thought it was a good debate on the green belt and the strengths of the approach that we'd taken. I didn't feel that anybody came up with an alternative method of reviewing the green belt, and although there might have been criticisms of some aspects of it, that in general the approach to a purposes assessment was essentially sound. You may have a different view. Don't know. interesting debate around employment floor space and the extent to which should be planning to meet the needs of the local economy, and to what extent there are exceptional circumstances. I think it's clearer from the outcome of the debate that there seems to be general agreement that there is exceptional circumstances for carrying out a review of the green belt to meet the need for housing. Less clarity, I think, around the need for the economy. So clearly I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, sir. Yes, I don't think I've got anything to add to that.
Has it caused you to rethink anything, or to have in your minds that maybe some changes are needed?
Well, I think we're interested in your thoughts there about what modifications.
I'm interested in yours. You've been listening to it as much as I have.
I think so. We're certainly happy to make any modifications that may be required to make the plan sound.
All right, look, I'll carry on with my script then, and you butt in where you want to. All right, I don't think it's sound. I'm not going to go into the details of it at this point, but a lot will probably come out. I think you can do a lot worse than actually, I don't know whether people are taking notes or not, but you've presumably got it recorded somewhere, is listen to what Mr. Bolton said yesterday afternoon. Because he went through a list of things that he thought were sound, and they're probably the major points. There probably are other areas as well, but it's not a bad start, that. Having said that, he went through a number of things like you don't comply with the framework because you've not made your objective assessed need. Well, that is strictly true, and the plan is unsound unless there are extenuating circumstances. The four reasons or the four bases on which you assess soundness, one of which is national policy. And whilst I think you have to comply with the other three, it's got to be positively prepared and justified and deliverable. But there are exceptions to national policy. All right, paragraph 14 says that you should meet, not 14, but 47 says you should meet the need, and 14 tells you the way to actually do development plans in the context of housing supply. But there is this caveat at the bottom that certain things don't necessarily have to play tribute to that, green belt being one of them. So, providing there's good reason and it's properly justified, then there's no, you can go against national policy. But I'm not advocating that we go against national policy just for the sake of doing it. That's the really good reasons. But that apart, I think what Mr. Bolton was saying, wasn't far off the mark. And I do genuinely think that we can make this plan sound, but it's as much in your hands, if not more, than it is in mine. I think you've probably got some choices, the answers to which I don't entirely understand or know at this point in time. I don't think I'm being unfair, correct me if I'm wrong, but your strategy does have a sort of growth bent to it in terms of the economy, or that's how it reads to me, and if it reads that way to me, it'll certainly read that way to some other people, if not everybody. That isn't wrong. If you want to stick with the growth strategy, with lots of sort of caveats in the objectives and the vision, etc., about growing well in Hatfield, and you can find the land in the greenbelt and take it out of the greenbelt to enable that to happen, then I'm not here to stop you doing that or to criticise it. What I think of as a planner to that doesn't matter. As long as it stacks up, as long as you can find the land to do it, then fine. If you can't do that, though, then I think maybe it has to be tweaked, if not re-looked at again. I'll say more about the form later, but from the point of view of the strategy, I'm quite happy to accept it at what the 2017 calculations suggest. I'm also quite happy to look at something else as well, and I'll pinpoint in a few areas where I'm concerned. They may not result in changes at the end of the day, and a lot, as I say, depends on the extent to which you want to think about maybe not providing as many houses as that's suggesting, but that's up to you. And all boils down to whether or not you can actually find sites to meet the requirement. And I'll say a bit more about the Greenbelt in a minute. If at the end of the day you come to the conclusion that you can't meet your housing requirement, whatever it is, then I've got to set out in my report why you're not meeting it and why that's justified. Now, excuse me. That's not impossible to do, but there has to be very sound reasons for doing it. You know, if you think about it, if every authority did the same thing, especially in this part of the country, then the country would be an even bigger mess than it seems to be getting into anyway. I mean, I certainly think the government is expecting people to provide local plans meeting their housing need. And the more that don't, the more the issue's just sort of left up in the ether, and it becomes more and more difficult to solve the housing crisis. In that context, and again I'll say a bit more later when I get onto the individual topics, but you have provided sites for employment. Now there's nothing wrong with that, and if you're going for an all-out growth strategy and you've got the land to do it, that's fine. If you're not going to do that, if you are telling me that there's not land in the Greenbelt to accommodate all the needs, then I have to basically answer the question, well, why are you creating more employment in the area on new land which could otherwise be used to provide houses that you're not able to meet? I mean, you need to answer that question. And, you know, you're creating more jobs, which in theory at least suggests that your place needs more people, not less. So somehow there needs to be some adjustment to marry it together. And in any case, I think there needs to be, as with housing, exceptional circumstances to justify releasing Greenbelt sites, so for employment use. I'm not saying you can't do that, but I don't think it's as straightforward as finding sites for housing. You know, you should be giving a high priority to providing sites for housing. You know, if you're not meeting your objectively assessed need, or if you're not meeting it by a significant margin.
Could I ask a question? To what extent then do you think the NPPF requires us to meet the needs of the economy? Do you think there's greater weight then on meeting the need for housing over and above?
That's a good question, that. I'm not sure overall that is what's meant, but in certain parts of the NPPF, there's certainly a lot more to hang meeting needs of housing than there is on meeting needs of employment. I mean, they're both not straightforward, and as I think I've said, it's not just a matter of saying, oh, well, we can't meet our objective assessed need, therefore we need land for housing, therefore the Greenbelt can go and we'll provide it all. It's a balancing exercise anyway. I tend to think with employment, there may well be cases, even if you're actually growing employment. I mean, the point that Mr. Hill was making about, you know, you having very good communications around a sort of linear belt down the middle of the district, you know, if employment's related to that and it's sustainable, then there may well be a good case for releasing Greenbelt land to accommodate it. If it's not that, and if it's actually going to, you know, result in increases in cars driving up and down the A1M and causing the traffic system to overload even more, then it's a bit harder to justify, especially, you know, when you're not meeting the housing need. If you're meeting the housing need as well, then I don't think there's an issue, but, you know, you need to find a lot of land to get there. I mean, the other extreme will be to go for a restraint strategy, which accepts that the Greenbelt constraints prevent you from continuing to grow at the same extent as you have in the past. And as I've just intimated, you could still with that have you know, some employment in what are sustainable locations. But to do that, then there's, I think, going to have to be, if you like, a better justification for keeping the green belt than we maybe have at the moment. I don't know. You might not agree with some of the things I'm going to say in a minute, but that's fine. While we're still on the development strategy, Mr. Cow and Mr. Quinton raised the issue of alternative strategies not being put forward. I need to go back and read what's actually been submitted by yourselves. I mean, do you agree with him, or are they just wide of the mark?
I certainly don't agree with them, sir. There was a lot of work done on alternative distribution strategies,
Yeah.
Which informed the 2012 Emerging Core Strategy, and there is a housing background paper which supported the publication of the Emerging Core Strategy, and that looked at different distribution strategies. It didn't include an option of a new settlement outside the borough, but I suppose at that time we weren't aware of there being any reasonable alternatives or as that being a deliverable option. And I think we also felt it would relate to a proposal which wasn't in the Welland Hatfield local plan. So was it for us to propose that as an option? But we certainly looked at different distribution options, sort of growth focused just around the two towns, limited growth around the villages, the expansion of existing villages. At that stage, it didn't include a new settlement because, again, that didn't seem to be a deliverable strategy or an option that was before us. That came in as an option later on in the process. But I think we certainly considered a variety of different distribution options. And I can give you the examination library reference. I can give you that through the programme officer, Sarah, if you want to look at it.
It's useful to write it down and save me searching forever for them, yeah. Yeah, okay. Although I'll soon know my way backwards through them all. Yeah, new settlement's about 2 lines down, actually, from where we are. I think it was Mr. Quinton who raised the issue about the needs of different parts of the district. I mean, all I would say is if you've not done that, it does need looking at, but I suspect you probably already have anyway. And as far as the argument about maintaining the Garden City principles and the resultant need for lower densities in certain parts of the district, and if you're going to sort of mirror what's happened in the past, that's probably going to roll forward into some of the new sites as well. I mean, I personally don't have an issue with that at all. As a plan, I think it's quite laudable that you're trying to do that. But again, it's a matter for yourselves to look whether or not the ramifications of that in terms of the numbers that you're accommodating justify doing it. I mean, they might do if you give a lot of weight to it. And
increasing density was one of the options we considered back at issues and options stage in 2009, and we had a whole sort of section on different densities and impact that could have on the character of the area. I think that the results of that consultation indicated that the maintenance of the character of our urban areas was very important to the local community, which is why we very much maintained the approach to densities. 30 to 50 dwellings per hectare would be an increase in density over the existing urban form, but it's one we feel can be accommodated without impacting on the character of the settlements. And I think as came out during the examination, where there are opportunities for higher density, then we've certainly as an authority have embraced those opportunities. Sort of going for, I think we were talking about 75 to 80 dwellings per hectare. It seems likely that we're going to have an application submitted to increase the density on that particular site, and obviously we'll look at that with due care. Have to be satisfied that can be the transport network, highway network can actually accommodate increased densities, and also any impact on listed buildings, because there are listed buildings which could potentially be affected by high density. So certainly not adverse to higher densities, and there is reference in the local plan to higher densities in suitable locations.
yeah, and I think as I said the other day, to me, not really knowing the place, it seemed a very nice sort of place to come and live. And if the British town planning system had repeated the Welwyn Garden cities of this world over the last 70 years, the whole country would be a lot better place for people to live in. So, you know, I've no issue with you wanting to sort of keep the principles behind that at all. You know, even if they do have ramification, I'm sure it could, for numbers, I'm sure you can justify it. Yeah, new settlement. If you're going to have a new settlement, wherever it is, I think it needs a bit more justification in the plan than we've got already. It needs to think about, you know, I suppose you might want to wait until you see where the discussions are going, because it might be that there's not a justification for the new settlement. Well, no, let me rephrase that. There may not be a justification for the new settlement that you're proposing, but there could well be a justification for a new settlement somewhere else. Although I wouldn't like to suggest where. I really wouldn't. But then I don't know the district that well.
Just to clarify, sir, when you talk about new settlement, are you referring or relating that to Simon's side, or are you thinking about the point made by Councillor?
Oh, I'm not talking about North Hertfordshire, no. I'm talking
No,
about...
no, I mean about Simon's side. Are you talking about wider options and wider thinking?
Well, I think, first of all, there's a principle, why, in the circumstances, do you need a new settlement in the Greenbelt, given that it's obviously going to set another area, urban area in the Greenbelt, which over time is going to want to grow, so that there's ramifications for that. And I think it needs setting in the context of, you know, your ability or otherwise to find land for housing in the Greenbelt. And as I say, I mean, it came to come out in the examination that there hadn't actually been a sort of call for sort of locations for new settlements. This one had just emerged out of the ether, and the council had decided to go along with it. Now, it may be the best location for a new settlement in the district. I honestly don't know. But as I say, if you accept the principle or come to the conclusion that the principle in the first place is something worth advancing, then having accepted that, you need to look at, well, is this the best place to put one? You know, are there not any other options? Might be. But I mean, my thoughts generally driving around is that the actual extent of green belt between existing settlements in Welwyn Hatfield is not that great compared to certain, I mean, even to the sort of, you know, green belts around Greater Manchester, once you get outside the urban cores of it. It's very surprising. So, you know, you always need to think very carefully. I mean, you could almost argue that if you took it in the context of Simonside could just go next to Hatfield, you know, over the road. And then at least you've got a reduced distance between Wheathampstead, isn't it, and Hatfield, rather than, if you like, a distance between Simonside and Hatfield and a distance between Simonside and Wheathampstead. Both of which are obviously going to be less than the distance between an extended Hatfield and Wheathampstead. But anyway, I'll say more about the new settlement when I've heard more evidence, and it'd be wrong of me to start sort of dropping down one way or the other, because I honestly don't really know, other than visiting the site and basically being, I suppose, influenced by what I saw there. I can't really comment any further. Again, partly related to the strategy, but it's a fringe matter. I think it was Mr. Waterhouse who brought that up about the town centre being an important location for business as well as for housing. I don't know to what extent you've actually got that in the policies for the individual sites, but if there are sites where it is suitable for mixed-use development, then it's probably worth enhancing.
Yes, we obviously haven't got on to sites, and I probably should have come back on that point, but there are allocations in the plan for both Welwyn Garden City Town Centre and Hatfield Town Centre. I think, as I said, there is the possibility, I think, that we could add to the allocations for Hatfield Town Centre, because sufficient progress has been made on you know, looking at the feasibility of sites, and I think we talked about it being indicated in the windfall assessment, and I think we're now got sufficient confidence that we could add an additional allocation. So that could be something that we would consider as an additional modification. So.
Yeah, I'll come back to that actually later, but it's interesting. The argument is usually the other way, that councils have been incredibly aspirational, you know, and it wouldn't have been the first local plan, you know, to have, you know, 500, 1,000 houses will be developed in Hatfield Town Centre, you know, post-2025, you know, and then the development industry is saying there's no way this is going to happen. We need the allocation somewhere else, thank you very much. Whereas, I mean, at least one or two of them were intimating that maybe it should be in as a proposal. Okay, let's move on to the housing market area. You've not used the one the framework says you should, so I'm going to have to write about why what you've done is fully justified. I don't have a problem trying to go along with what you've actually done in terms of forecasts for Welwyn Hatfield as a district, but I do have to say something about the housing market. And in particular, if we're going along with the forecast for Welwyn Hatfield about its sort of extended housing market area with the little bits in the 8 adjacent districts. So, as was said the other day, it would be helpful if it can be satisfied that the foam within the whole housing market is being met, or if it's not being met, you know, why is it not being met? And I know you can't really start looking at the greenbelt issues in the other districts or anything like that. And if you're not meeting it all yourself, then you could say, why does it matter? But if they're not meeting it, then it's obviously going to compound the problem, isn't it? And I think at the very least it needs to be stated, and you know, well, reasons pointed out why it's not achievable, if that's possible. So. I mean, it was said by somebody from the development industry the other day that it wouldn't be difficult to work it out. I don't know whether it is or not, but can you have a look at whether or not you could actually find out what the housing need is of the little bits of the other districts that are in yours? I mean, presumably you can get Edge Analysis or Turley to just basically look at the population and assume same sorts of, you know, household formation rates as in Welwyn Hatfield, and then find out what's proposed in the other local plans, most of which I presume are at a stage where you can do that now if they've not gone beyond it.
Certainly for a number of authorities we can do that. Hertsmere, just as I said previously, are just consulting on their issues and options, but they have, so it would be difficult to say what proportion would be proposed to be met in their housing market area.
But if they've got proposals for the bit next to Cuffley.
So they've got so these are just options at the moment, but there are options around Potters Bar. As I mentioned, there's an option for a new garden village, part of which might be within Welwyn Hatfield or may not be within Welwyn Hatfield. So there are a range of options that they are considering. They've certainly committed in their document to meeting their full OAN, but the precise distribution is unclear at the moment. St Albans have obviously haven't been able to progress their local plan, but they have they have committed to with their revised local plan meeting their full OAN. Yeah.
I mean, the problem is if we're arguing that Welwyn Hatfield and the little bits tacked onto it is a separate housing market area, it's a bit rich then to be sort of saying, if you look at East Hertfordshire, that allocations around Bishop's Stortford or Harlow are therefore sort of meeting the need of the piece next to Welwyn Hatfield. You know, you're back to the argument, you know, shouldn't it have been a much bigger housing market area, but I don't want to go there because it'll end up being a circular argument.
Well, I suppose the position of Turley's is that whilst in 2014 they felt the defined housing market area was the appropriate housing market area, their subsequent work indicated that actually we should be looking at the wider housing market area, which comprised the entire local authority areas.
Well, I'm happy to stick with that, providing we can make it stack up.
Yes.
Okay.
So you're happy with the wider housing market area approach?
No, well, the wider housing market area has not got a foam, has it? I mean, it's got individually added up amounts, but I'm not sure that's necessarily a full objective assessed housing need. I want to stick with Welling Hatfield and the
Right.
forecast you've done.
Yes.
So I just need to satisfy myself that that and the pieces that are quite clearly part of your housing market area, even if they're in some other district, are meeting their needs.
Okay. Okay. So the defined area, the
Yeah.
smaller area. Okay.
You might find when you add it up that this has been optimistic, I know, but you know, there's more houses being built there than they need, so it can come off your total. Is that wishful thinking? I don't know. All right. The other point I thought about that when I was thinking it through is there must be residents in those areas that will move into Welling Hatfield anyway for housing. Now, I don't know what the flows are, but if they are positive in your favour, then they will presumably have been taken into the sort of migration element of your housing forecast, so that, if you like, they can come off what's been provided or be added on to what's been provided in those areas to make it more favourable. You follow where I'm coming from there? Yeah.
Looking at the completions within those housing market areas, does that be all?
No.
Or just to know in terms of the overall numbers, because
I mean, a simplistic
assumptions
way
were-
of doing it is if you say, look at East Hertfordshire, they're proposing so many houses at Birchall, which is, if I've interpreted the map right, it's basically meeting the housing needs of Hertford. Well, that's who it's alleged to be supplying, Hertford, right? Okay, so if Birchall provision is more than Hertford needs, then there's a surplus. But it just struck me that people probably move from Hertford to Welling anyway. People probably move from Welling to Hertford as well. But if the flow is in your favour, if more people normally would move from Hertford to Welling than the other way, then they're going to be an element of your inward migration target, the bit that's supposedly not international migrants. And that probably needs taken into the equation as well. Okay. Right, so if we move on to the overall form, as I said, if you want to go along with where we're at, about 16,000 dwellings, I don't think I'd have a great issue, as long as you have to at least demonstrated that you're trying to accommodate it, even if at the end of the day you say you can't. If you're wanting to think about looking at ways to tweak it, then again, I don't have an issue with that. I do, and I'm really speaking here now as a planner who was an economist, and whether I liked it or not, certainly earlier in my career I had to look at these things when they were an awful lot simpler than they are now, to be honest. But unrecorded population change, that does strike me as very fishy, particularly what's in some of the documents about, the alleged numbers by the Office of Population in mid-year estimates following 2011 census, what happened between 2001 and 11, and the fact that it doesn't seem at all to marry up with your house building rates whatsoever. And I mean, the main problem with that is it's giving you a high starting point if it's wrong. So I tend to think that does need looking at again. I mean, if you look at the graph, it just seems to sort of almost go up a cliff on I think it's 2015-16, and Office of Population, I mean, they do an incredibly good job, but again, it's not an exact science, and I mean, what you're saying is it's not the only place where this has happened. I mean, they're quite often in parts of the north of England get it wrong the other way around, but I think it does need looking at again. Bad headship rates, I agree with the principle that they should be in. I don't think I'd go along with them coming out. Although it perhaps wants looking again as to how they're doing it, because they appear to be almost putting them back up from day one. I'm not convinced that what will happen. It'll be a gradual process, if you like, as affordability hopefully improves, so that the rates will be higher, in 2032 than they are in, 2020. Might not make a lot of difference actually to the numbers. I don't know exactly how they've calculated it, but as a matter of principle, I think it's unrealistic to assume there's going to be a big step change, and that let's say house building doubles in the next 2 or 3 years. Suddenly, the headship rate plummets up, because I don't think house prices will suddenly come down. That's going to take time as incomes rise to sort of catch them up. Student accommodation was raised. The fact that they're building halls of residence, but the university, in terms of student numbers, is not expanding. That being the case, there might not be many people at the end of the day, but I don't know. It may be that more students are going into institutional establishments, halls of residence, and therefore they're not actually in the general population wanting to form households and need housing. Again, it's perhaps worth asking them to look at it. On market signals, I don't know the answer to that, to be perfectly honest, because I can't remember. There's a formula in the National Planning Advisory Group's report that suggests, I don't know if you've seen that and looked at it. No. But, I mean, providing it's not a million miles away from what was being recommended in that, I don't think 10%'s unreasonable, especially given the sort of circumstances.
And our consultants have applied that on top of the new household form information rate rather than the exit figures.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you got to do that. Yeah. I mean, if you want to come up with a reason why it shouldn't, I'll look at it. Moving on to employment forecasts, I don't have any issue with them. I think what you've done is a sensible way to do it. In terms of land need, you might want to look at what Plutus was saying about densities and what have you. I think that is actually very real, but a lot depends on what you end doing. If you're encouraging B8 warehouses, then you're going to have low densities of employment all over the place. But if what your plan's seeking to do is not to encourage that, but to try to get office-based employment or things that are of that sort of ilk, then you're going to have much higher densities than you would have in conventional B1 calculations.
We used, in order to calculate how much floor space we needed, we used the ACA factors, which I think was in 2010.
Yeah.
Sort of standard floor space rates, but we are aware that some businesses and offices do occupy higher rates. But the approach we're talking in the actual forecast for 2 years or 10 years rather than
Yeah.
that might be something we could produce additional.
I mean, I'm not sure why Plutus were arguing that, because they were arguing for employment allocations as well. And, if you take their arguments as conclusions, if you're increasing employment densities in the existing employment areas, then you need less land. But it suggests that what they were saying probably has some truth about it.
I think it related to an application that they're submitting where there is a requirement for a minimum amount of business floor space,
Yeah.
I suspect.
Okay, whatever. Yeah, all right. There usually are hidden motives, aren't there? All right. So let's move on to the Greenbelt. As far as exceptional circumstances is concerned, I'll be using what the judge said in Calverton, which most people just seem to think that that was the way to do it. As I've said, if you're telling me at the end of the day that you can't possibly meet the need, then I need to satisfy myself that the land that remains in the Greenbelt is essential to enable the purposes to be continually met and to maintain openness. When I've been asking through the programme officer for further information on the Greenbelt, what I'd ideally have liked, but it's probably not available, is a plan that basically takes forward what came out of your two-stage Greenbelt review, and really says, these parts of Welling Hatfield Greenbelt, create openness, which contributes to one or more of the Greenbelt functions, and under no circumstances, if we, are accepting the sort of principle of Greenbelts in the British planning system that we currently have, under no circumstances, should they be built on. There's just no-go areas, end of story. Now, from what I've seen of the Welling Hatfield Greenbelt, whilst I think there's a lot of that about, I don't think the whole area is that at all. I just don't. Again, my impression is that it's probably more precious west of the A1M than it is east of the A1M, because there just seems to be more of it to the east in terms of openness. Although a lot of it's not in your district. You don't have to go certainly around Welling Garden City, you don't have to go very far, and you're in East Hertfordshire, but get a bit further south and there's quite a lot, but then a big chunk of it's prejudiced by Hatfield Park. Historic parks and gardens, I won't say they're unique, but they're different circumstances to what other people might have. So, yeah. But I take it there isn't actually anything else other than what I've had in those two studies.
No, there isn't.
All right.
What you're asking for is there any evidence that we could do before the end of the examination which would help in that decision?
Yeah, I don't know, did you think about doing a fully fledged Greenbelt review?
I think we thought we'd done one, but
okay.
but clearly, if what you're asking for is that next step to define what's absolutely critical, I suppose what we were looking at is the extent to which the land in the Greenbelt still fulfilled the function, the purposes. But I think what you're sort of saying, okay, but is it all essential to be kept?
Well, this is right. I think I made a remark yesterday when the gentleman was talking about Hertsmere, when I thought that the inspector had said that they couldn't possibly meet any more requirement in Hertsmere Greenbelt, and here we are sort of releasing more land from the Greenbelt within about 10 years of them doing it. Well, it makes a bit of a mockery of what the guidance says about Greenbelts, because, we're supposed to be reviewing them, well, not every plan period, if you like, so really, ideally, what ends up out of this plan ought to endure till somewhere around about 2050. And, there ought to be safeguarded land, to come in the period after 2030.
We've estimated that if we need to take sufficient land out of the Greenbelt for another 15 years after this plan, we'd be looking at around
2047. I'm not going to argue about 3 years.
That would require about 600 hectares to come out of the Greenbelt.
Yeah. Yeah, unless, if enough authorities, start shouting about it, if they feel really concerned about the Greenbelt, then maybe the national government will do something about it. And, take the pressure off. And, people suddenly realise that, if we go on as we are, by the end of this century, then the Greenbelt will look nothing like what it did in 1947. It just won't.
I think it'll be a series of green wedges, not a belt.
Yeah, which would be a shame because, just driving down, I've been staying in Stevenage this week because it was the only place in budget. as I was saying yesterday, you don't have enough hotels in Welling Garden City, so as bad as Mansfield for that. But you know, just driving down the A1M, you know, as a motorist, you look across at certain points. I know a lot of it's in wood, but you know, you see big expanses of open countryside with very little or no buildings in it. And from the point of view of, you know, if you like, protecting the countryside from encroachment and then for its use by the urban populations nearby, that must be really valuable, that. And, you know, there's a lot of difference between able to walk in an area that's, let's say, 10 square miles of countryside than, a green wedge that's a kilometre wide. An awful lot of difference. You know, you can actually, I imagine in certain parts of that sort of drive on the western side of the motorway, you can walk there and you can think you're anywhere, not that you're in the middle of a very densely populated area. And so, well, this is me as a planner now rather than as an inspector, but I think they're important. Yeah, I mean, what I'd really like to know is what are the areas that need to be kept permanently open to maintain the purposes of the Greenbelt as we currently understand them, okay? And I was going to ask you, I mean, you said yesterday that you'd got this threshold of 1 kilometre. Does that apply to everything, even to towns, or is it just to, little settlements?
It was when we were trying to differentiate, I suppose, between sites, and we just came up with, when we're looking at fragile gaps, we came up with a definition of anything which was going to be result in a gap of less than 1 kilometre was a fragile gap, and we would seek to protect that. We applied it to both towns and villages, but we gave greater weight to gaps between towns. Than town to village or village to village.
I mean, for what it's worth, another concept is whether you can actually see the settlements at the other side, the sphere of, coalescence. If you stood on the edge of Hatfield, can you see St Albans? If you can, then you have to question, well, should there be any development in the gap then? Because you're just going to make it worse.
Yes, we did also in some instances look at visual impact and sort of visual impact on visual openness as well as physical openness. Yeah,
well, I mean, that's what it's about, isn't it, really? If you've got a big hill in the way, then it's not as critical as if, you can see across flat fields for 2 or 3 miles. And if you're wanting something to hang that on, paragraph 85 of the framework does say that you shouldn't be including land which is unnecessary to keep permanently open. This area is not going to be that different to what it is near where I come from. I don't live 1,000 miles from Calverton. And a lot of people, certainly members of the public, have got different conceptions as to what Greenbelt is about. And when there are proposals to alter the Greenbelt, it sets up lots of hairs running on costs and things. But that doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't go there. I also think the point that was raised about the washed over villages needs looking at. Because it was said on more than one occasion that you could have some development in washed over villages, but I mean, my understanding of washed over villages is they're in the Greenbelt because their whole area is contributing to the Greenbelt's openness. And if you build anything other than the odd house for an agricultural worker's dwelling, then you're rather eroding that openness. And you must then get to a point where it's not really contributing to the Greenbelt's openness, it's an urban settlement. And, I mean, again, paragraph 86 is quite clear about that. If you're wanting to protect rural settlements from development, there are other ways of doing it. I mean, if they've got historic or architectural character, you make them a conservation area and, you stop development that way, or you just use normal development management policies. I mean, the area where I live is not a Greenbelt, but, some of the villages are not awash with development because the council stop it, because they've got policies to stop it. and it doesn't have to be greenbelt. I mean, I haven't actually been to any of them, so I don't know to what extent they shouldn't be there or should be there, but I think it wants looking at.
So sort of PPG2 used to provide a bit more guidance about different categories of villages and
Didn't it? Yeah.
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 I mean, the MPPF does still allow for infill development in washed over villages, which is why we sort of come up with
Yeah.
a policy of sort of no more than 4 in a gap.
But I mean, does it mean as much as that?
Well, not necessarily, sir, but I suppose we felt we needed to provide some sort of
Yeah, I mean,
guidance.
four in one village is probably nothing to worry about. But if you end up 4 and then 3 houses down the street, there's another 2, and it goes on. Well, as I say, there comes a point when what is this contributing to the Greenbelt's openness? It isn't. In fact, it's stopping its openness, because if you stand a kilometre away and look at it, you don't see 1.5 kilometres, 2 kilometres if the landscape's flat. You see this village in it.
So what you're suggesting, sir, is we should be looking to perhaps exclude some of the
Yeah.
existing washover
Yeah, I think
settlements from
so.
the
Yeah.
Greenbelt.
If they don't justify it, I mean, that's not to say you shouldn't have other policies. I mean, what you were saying about sustainability of some of these locations rings true, but that's not a reason for making them greenbelt. It's probably a reason for saying there shouldn't be development there. I mean, it's no different. I mean, the plan I'm just finishing in Cumbria, I mean, they've got policies in which prevent development other than for sort of special modal needs, in places that don't have bus services, for an obviously good reason. Okay, it's okay if you've got a car, but, a large section of the population don't have a car, so why should you be providing housing there for them? Yeah.
Just going back to coalescence, you talked about coalescence between towns and obviously larger villages. How do you feel about actually coalescence between different settlements? Because sometimes, I mean, we have got places where there is only a field that actually stops one settlement from merging into another.
I don't think it's necessary to keep, if you like, the current pattern of settlements exactly as it is. I think it's important when you've got town identity, large village identity, you don't want them coalescing with one another, but if you've got little hamlets that are only 100 yards from a larger urban area, I do wonder what's the benefit of it. But then a lot depends on history and local circumstances, what the landscape's like, etc. I think it would be wrong to sort of being prescriptive and trying to sort of have criteria that you probably got to have criteria, but like you were saying at the start, it's better not to be qualitative about the Greenbelt rather than to be quantitative about it, and not to have sort of tables with numbers. I think the same applies there. I mean, I was actually driving backwards and forwards to Stevenage and go along the strip of land from the viaduct through to on the railway to the motorway, and you can't see much of Digswell because of the trees in the way, but it's obviously very close to Welling, and given the sort of the landscape there, that river valley going through there, even if it wasn't Greenbelt, if I was a planner, I'd be suggesting that it should be down as an open break, or a green wedge, or whatever you want to call it. But I mean, in terms of prevent the general metropolitan objectives of the Greenbelt, it probably doesn't sort of stand up very well. But there's probably a lot of local significance to that. And we're not that short of land that we can't protect things like that, whether they're Greenbelt or not. I was just going to ask you about Hat 2, because I don't really know anything about it other than it cropped up. It was in and the members took it out. Again, I haven't been there, so I don't know what the topography is like. But just looking at it on a plan, just an ordnance base, there doesn't seem to be much of a gap between that Hatfield and actually the sort of ribbons extensions of St Albans there. So I'm assuming it was put forward and then taken out. Why was it taken out?
So just before we go on to that, can I check, are we moving away from the green belt issues more generally?
Well, we'll do
No.
when we've got off that, yeah.
Right. Well, can I just raise a couple of points just
Yeah.
for consideration? In relation to the test that you're inviting the local authority to apply going forward, there's been reference to considering whether or not land is essential to the purposes of the green belt. Can I just clarify whether the touchstone that you're using for those purposes is really paragraph 85 of the MPPF, which you referred to fairly recently, to not include land which is unnecessary to keep permanently open? Or is there some other, as it were, touchstone or threshold that you think we ought to be applying when we consider this issue?
No, I'd stick it at that.
Thank you. And then in relation to the issue of safeguarding, I think you heard some evidence as to the council's approach for why it hadn't safeguarded land within this iteration of the local plan. You've heard Ms Tiley say that if we were to consider an approach which sought to make the greenbelt boundaries secure for one further or two further iterations of the local plan process, then we'd be potentially looking at very significant release from the greenbelt into the category of safeguarded land. And we've done some rough calculations in relation to that. 600 hectares is one figure that's being considered. I think it would assist us to know, perhaps not today, but in the relatively near future, whether you are satisfied in terms of the approach to soundness, which is what we have to go back to at the end of the day, whether the council's approach is unsound in reaching a view in principle that it doesn't have to seek to safeguard land in circumstances where its own analysis of the green belt demonstrates that in fact applying paragraph 85 it can't meet the existing OAN.
If we're satisfied that having done those tests
Exactly.
and we can't meet the current need, then we shouldn't be able to meet much future need either.
Quite.
Now, if we're at that stage, I don't have an issue with it at all. I'm not sure we will be at that stage, but I don't know.
No, I just
without
wanted to be
seeing the information.
clear about the
Yeah.
stages in the analysis.
I mean,
That's very helpful.
If you read the framework and interpret it as it's written, then you should be making provision for development beyond the life of this plan by proposing safeguarded land. Now, to what extent you do that and to what end date you go to is obviously arguable, but it quite clearly ought to be, beyond 2040, I would suggest, if your plan's going to 2033. And it depends really what comes out of your analysis. If your analysis, I say, is has got a line on the said it's not going ever beyond these sort of points, and there's not there's not enough room to put what we've got now, and there's a clear case for doing it. And it acts as a vehicle, if you like, to put a marker down to government that, look, you can't expect places like Welling Hatfield to keep, finding land for tens of thousands of houses every 20 years.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Okay. Yeah, Hat 2, you were going to tell me about it.
Right. Hat 2 is related to the review of the regional spatial strategy. So you remember me saying that in the RSS there was an indication that land to the west of Hatfield could potentially meet the need for housing identified in the East of England plan, which was the subject of a legal challenge, and then that part of the East of England plan was withdrawn.
You challenged that?
We didn't actually, so it was the County Council and St Albans Council
Oh, right.
challenged the East of England plan, and so the allocations for Welland Hatfield, I'm trying to think, was it, and Decorum were actually removed from the, or they were reverted back to the Secretary of State, but because we had a change of government and a change in approach, that part of the East of England plan was never resolved, so we were for some time without any indication of what figures we should be planning
Oh,
for.
right.
But there was reference to land west of Hatfield, and that was as a consequence of representations made to the East of England plan from the landowners of Hatto. Hatto relates to, forms part of the larger Hatfield aerodrome site, which was brought forward for development in the last local plan, and was so was for mixed-use development, but around 2,000 dwellings, new sort of local neighbourhood centre, employment, new campus for the university, and then substantial part of the site was put in the Greenbelt and was subject to a Section 106 agreement for the remainder of the site to be brought forward as a country park. But also as part of that Section 106, there were proposals that minerals would be extracted from the site, and that part of the site is in the minerals local plan as a preferred minerals area. Part of the land in their ownership also lies within St Albans District Council, so the land ownership crosses the boundary. The landowners have promoted that part of the area which was to come forward as a country park could in fact be released for housing, and that was a submission to this council at various stages during the production of the plan. We've considered it as an option which could either be included in the plan or potentially be safeguarded. On scrutiny of the Section 106 agreement, it became clear to us that St Albans would need to be part of any variation to that Section 106 agreement, and St Albans have always objected to that proposal coming forward, and therefore there became some uncertainty of delivery. Further, the landowners put in a mineral planning application to implement the allocation for minerals extraction, and it became clear that it's going to take around 30 years for the site to be extracted. So if the housing site were to come forward at the same time as minerals extraction, which it would need to do to be included in this local plan, then the land left available for Country Park would be quite small indeed, and would need to move around the site as parts of the site were extracted for minerals.
Yeah.
So in that circumstance, I think officers concluded that it shouldn't really come forward as a site during the plan period, but that it might be considered suitable to safeguard for future development. However, I think members felt that it was more important to retain the whole site as a country park rather than consider the opportunity for part of it to come forward for residential development, and that was a decision not to safeguard the land. Hence it coming in and out.
All right. And the people that were in evidence, certainly at the legal session then, want it putting in as a safeguarded site?
I think they would ideally like to see it allocated in the plan, because their view is that there would be some form of country park even whilst the mineral extraction is going on. Their view is that St Albans don't need to be a signatory to the variation to the Section 106 agreement, and therefore there isn't any impediment on delivery. And furthermore, they think that, I think they were objecting on duty to cooperate grounds. So I think they felt that if the plan, I don't want to prescribe motives into but
right. I mean, is it in the actual break between Hatfield and St Albans, or is it south of it?
no, it is It is in it. I mean, I suppose you could argue that a part of the site wouldn't extend Hatfield any closer.
Okay.
Depending on where you
Where you
draw the
draw the
line on the map.
boundaries,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But certainly, yes, it is. It probably lies within that strategic graph
Yeah.
if you record
Okay.
the pink the pink lines.
Yeah. Maybe I won't need to go there. Get involved.
Because they have identified it as being capable of delivering very similar numbers to Simon's Heights.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Finally, housing land supply. I've not got any real issues with it personally, but I tend to think that at some point in time, before we reach the end of this process and go back to housing land supply, it will be helpful if you could set out what in just one place, because you can find them if you go down about this in documents, just what assumptions you've used about matters of deliverability and density. And I totally agree that it's not just as simple as that, because, you know, as you found with this site at, was it Weetabix? Shredded wheat, sorry. Nearly there. Where have they gone to as a matter of interest?
The factory has gone to Swindon, I believe.
Oh, that's all right. It's not gone to Czechoslovakia then?
No, no,
It's
no.
okay.
And and I believe the research and development unit are still within Welwyn Garden City.
All right. Well, yeah, it's the best job you've kept then. Yeah. I tend to think that, you know, obviously when sites come forward, then you change whatever the planning permissions are for. But I tend to think as far as, you know, the allocations are concerned and the other sites that don't have planning permission that are in the table, it would be helpful if we could see just what the basic criteria were used to actually generate the number of dwellings. I'll probably try, when we get, you know, towards the end of the process, you presumably be doing, when will you be doing a new update? Will it be, it'll be based on next March, I presume? When do you tend to sort of get them published?
The annual monitoring report is normally published sort of shortly after Christmas. But I think you have the up-to-date figures that would appear in the new annual monitoring report. And then we normally start the process in March for collecting all the data. So
All right, so it's going to be this time next year before the next one comes out?
We are due to publish one either the end of this year or the beginning of next year, but that will contain the data that you already have before you, sir. And then we wouldn't start counting until for completions for next year, until this financial year is completed.
So the one that you're about to do then will need tweaking to include whatever are allocated sites that are immediately developable, etc.
I think our approach has been to include allocated sites in our housing land supply on the assumption that we go.
All right, so all the current local plan proposals are in the. Oh, all right, okay. What happens if they get kicked out?
Then we'd have to redo it. So.
All right, it's very presumptuous. Oh, I'm surprised no one's challenged that. The trouble is, people have got nowhere to go here, have they, with appeals? I don't suppose you get very many housing appeals because it's unlikely for inspectors to allow land in the Greenbelt to be developed if there's not a 5-year land supply. Or am I wrong?
I think we do get quite a few appeals, but not necessarily for large sites in the Greenbelt as yet.
No, at the moment we're getting small appeals, but the large ones, because of the local plan process and the stage we're in, we've been discussing all of those. Depending what happens with this process will influence what happens in the future in the developer's mindset of what to do.
Okay. Yeah, as I say, could do with the paper setting out, so it's all in one place. And at some point, when we're getting towards the end of the examination, I will ask you to update it. You probably won't have much work to do if it's already there. Although you might have to throw a lot more sites in, I don't know. And you presumably have to base it on whatever the objective assessor needs going to be, because that's going to change. But I wouldn't want you to go back, you know, examining all the sites with planning permissions and all that sort of thing again. I mean, it's just, pointless for what difference it makes. But I'd want that in the public domain and for people to make representations really and write it about it before we get going. Whether we actually get a lot of involvement for the development industry for the reasons I was saying yesterday, I'm not quite sure. In my last local plan, it was like drawing teeth. I mean, they were really keen arguing about the foam was too low and, you know, all that sort of thing. And when it came to sort of saying that the council hadn't got a well, they'd say the council hadn't got a 5-year land supply, but they wouldn't really say why. Yeah. All right, that's all I have to say on those matters. Just another couple of points that I want to bring up. You can maybe answer. I mean, I've asked you about HAT2 as we're going through. What's the position in terms of Birchill? It seems, looking at the plan, walking across the site, that for what's proposed, it's an enormously big site. I know there's some historic fill there, but is that the main? Is that the reason, or are there other reasons why it's?
That's the reason, sir. Yes, it's contaminated land, and the landowners don't think it's appropriate to put housing on the.
They don't.
Yeah. All
right. You get sort of 2 feet high cabbages and things there, would you? In your garden.
I wouldn't claim to be an expert on contaminated land, sir, but I understand it's probably more to do with land movement and contamination leaching
it's
out.
not consolidated properly.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that the reason then why, although the majority of the land by good margin is in Hatfield, the majority of the houses are in East Hertfordshire? Seems very unfair to me, that.
Yes, because the land in East Hertfordshire isn't contaminated, and that's the part of the site where minerals would come out prior to development. I think that the dwelling numbers are now around 1350 in East Herts and 1200 in Welland Hatfield. Originally there was a greater disparity, but yes, essentially it's because the land in Welland Hatfield is quite constrained by the contamination.
And you know the full extent of that?
We believe we do, sir. There is a report in the examination library produced by Royal Haskening, which has been looked at by our environmental health officers. So I believe and I know that they have done borehole testing, which I believe our environmental health officers are satisfied that the borehole testing is on land adjoining the contamination, so we know that it doesn't extend to a larger area. There are parts of the site which have been subject to continual monitoring. That's parts of the contaminated land which have been subject to continuous monitoring, and there are other parts of the site which are undergoing monitoring at the current time.
Okay.
Not switched on. I'll speak up. Just following up on the infrastructure matters that we touched on. Is there any area where you feel, in terms of the submitted plan and sites, that you need further clarification or information around any of those, transport, education, or indeed any other matter that you may have picked up so far in what you've read?
Well, if what you were saying yesterday comes to fruition, then I tend to think it will sort it.
Okay.
Okay. If it doesn't, if you get to a point when, for whatever reason, it is very unlikely that the third secondary school would like to come forward, for example, then let me know.
Okay.
With regard to primary schools, they'll come out when we start talking about settlements. If it's changed, you'll know that, again, bring that evidence to those. And again, the same applies with highways. But to actually give it great weight and to sort of use the highways as a justification for limiting the amount of development, they're going to have to send you a letter that sort of says we think that the conditions on the A1M or the road that goes to Hertford, I forget its number, are going to be so severe that we will formally object to the plan.
Yeah.
And okay, that's a good reason, but getting them to do that sort
Yeah,
of
there's no
thing is not
evidence
easy.
at the moment that
It's
is
just
the case,
not.
no.
And I know that from wearing another hat in the past.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Right. Right, does anybody want to raise anything else?
Just a general process question, really. So I think yesterday you indicated that you would be writing to us in a couple of weeks' time. Is that still the case to set
Do you
out?
need me
all
to write in a couple of weeks' time? I mean,
I'm just
has anybody
asking.
been doing any minutes? It's been recorded, so I mean, it's... Say that again?
We will need your next lot of questions
My next set of questions.
for the next set of...
Oh, yeah, we'll talk about that in the session in a second.
Sorry, sir, could we just ask a question? Do you want us to complete this work before we continue with the next
No.
sections of the examination?
No.
I think I'd put the marker out that to do this work whilst the team are also preparing for the sessions, and we've already had, as a result of the hearing session yesterday, demands for meetings on the back of some of the things that were said, and what's been said today, no doubt we will have to be alert to the team's capacity to do everything at the same time. You know, we obviously want to get this plan through as quick as possible, but, you know, to review some of this work and go back through some of those assumptions while also preparing for the future sessions, and there may be issues that arise in those sessions that are pertinent to where we take this in totality. So I just put that marker out that, you know, we will aim to do as much as we possibly can, but it will take a bit of time to do it alongside all the other issues we need to prepare
I don't
for.
want to hold the plan up at all, and I'll do my best not to do that, even though I've obviously got other work, because I can't justify working here all the time. But what you do needs to be done thoroughly for the reasons I was saying at the first. You know, I'm going to end up using it as the basis for writing the soundness report, and I don't want it being challenged in the courts if we can avoid it at all. All right, so we need to be robust with what we're doing. And if that means taking time, it means taking time. And I'm not suggesting that we take years. I'm not raising the... I mean, some inspectors do, I know, but I've never seen the point. I'm not suggesting that I should formally write to you, if you like, and suspend the plan till you do X, Y, and Z. If you're happy for it just to be kept rolling along, I'm happy for it to be kept rolling along. As long as I've got general indications as to when you will have finished the work, so I can actually plan my work. I mean, we work in 6-week cycles, so unless I want to read other people's decisions or maybe do, you know, the odd HAS case, that's like housing extensions and things, which is not easy to find inspectors for, then if I don't give them 6 weeks notice, there's issues around it, because obviously, you know, the sort of work that I tend to do, inquiries and, you know, some of them quite big ones, they plan months in advance, and they're putting the programme months in advance. So, but as long as you tell me, and if you're going to slip, again, you let Louise know, then it's not an issue.
Yeah, we'd like the plan to continue, the exam to continue, and we'll look at the work and propose a timetable to get that to you. And to
I mean, for
everyone else.
what it's worth, I know, I mean, on 2 occasions there were no staff because they all left. But I am still finishing this local plan in Cumbria, which I started in January, almost 2 years ago. I want this finished before 2 years are up. I hope you're not all going to up sticks and leave because the task's so daunting. But, I don't suppose you will. So yeah, we'll go along on that basis. As long as you keep Louise informed of where we're at. You need to go away and, you know, assess what you need to do and what it's going to take. Have you spoken to them, Louise, about the development policies here? The development policies sessions.
No, I haven't had a chance to talk about the actual dates, no.
Okay, well, you can, I mean, we've got one planned for the beginning of December, and we were talking, I mean, it's just about possible to do everything for then, but it's going to be tight, and we were talking this morning as whether we could consider delaying them a week or two or a month or so. Think about it from your point of view. As I see them, they can happen any time. And I don't see why we can't have sessions on some of the bigger sites as well. but I'll be guided by what you think about that. But, you know, if we're going to have we're going to have one on Birchill at some point with East Arts anyway. And we're obviously going to have one on Simon's side and one on the site at Panzanger at some time. Maybe, I don't know, that hat one, is there a need for one? Probably will be. I don't see any problem in going ahead and doing those before you finished all the other work. Okay, it's going to get difficult to starting having sessions on villages unless you've sorted out where you're going with a green belt around it, for one thing. And there might be other matters you want to look at as well, so they may end up having to wait. But I'm sure there's plenty to keep us busy.
Okay, so what we'll do is scope out what work is required and perhaps come back to you via programme officer with a programme.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, the main thing is knowing what I'm doing for the next 6 weeks, 2 months, all right, and just keep that rolling forward, providing I've got a couple of months' notice about this is going to slip, there isn't an issue. Okay. Right, all right, thanks very much. For what it's worth, I've actually enjoyed this week. I hope you have. But I will need 2 days to chill out now before I go to Blackpool on Monday.
Good luck, sir.
Yeah.
I understand you have a police escort, is that correct?
Yeah, well, yeah, next week's a pre-inquiry meeting, so that'll be probably tedious, but it'll be okay. You know, it's people saying they want to participate, and the difficulty with it is that in principle the Secretary of State's allowed 2 appeals round there. So in principle, I'd be very surprised if he doesn't approve a 3rd one in principle. But there are highway issues, which is what it's really all going to be about. But the difficulty for me will be keeping people talking about highways and the ramifications of, you know, the so-called transport plan they've put in place. But we shall see. Okay.